Joining me today is Dr. Ben Lohmeyer. He is a lecturer in social work at Flinders University. He studies cultures of violence and bullying in schools. He has worked as a youth worker for over a decade. He's the author of the book Youth and Violent Performativities. Today, he's going to talk to us about youth subcultures here in Australia. So Ben, I'm a little bit confused in terms of what Australian culture is. Sometimes it feels like we have to hit a reset button, turn it off, and turn it on again because it's not really doing much. What's going on with it?
Yeah, look, man, I wish I had a really good answer for you of what Australian culture is, but I feel like most people are pretty confused. And I think it's partly because we have some strange history, and it's also many kind of competing ideas of what Australian culture is. I mean, a big part of that is as well that we have a long and important Indigenous history, Indigenous culture in this country that doesn't get as much kind of recognition as it deserves, but is increasingly kind of given voice or given acknowledgement in this sort of space. So often conversations like this will start with an acknowledgement that says, we're meeting today for us on Kaurna land, that spiritual connection with land is really important, and we want to pay respect to Indigenous elders past, present and future. That kind of stuff's really important because it acknowledges not just the Indigenous history, but also that Indigenous cultures and history are multiple as well, because there's many nations. So like that, Australian culture has many kind of influences from a range of different cultures, a range of different ethnicities. But one of the things that kind of springs to mind for me when I think about Australian culture is this terrible ad that was on TV during the 1970s. And it had this, if we went back and found a horrific theme song where they sung about football and meat pies and kangaroos and Holden cars, as if that was the dominant and only culture in Australia. And it's kind of pretty funny because a lot of that stuff's pretty outdated.
Yeah, like I find the best meat pies in Vietnamese bakeries, and Holden has closed up shop here in South Australia, so it's not even here anymore.
Exactly. So, I mean, maybe it's good that the culture has changed, but many bits of Australian culture are different, and there's lots of diversity there. One of the really useful kind of frameworks I find for thinking about this is there's a class theorist in sociology. His name is Perry Bourdieu, and he talks about class having both social and, cultural and economic components. So, you can have somebody who is, perhaps wealthy, has lots of money, but is kind of low social capital, and they might be someone we talk about as like, there's the phrase cashed up bogans, right? So you've got these people who work in a mining kind of labor kind of space, but they have a lot of money.
Okay, so let me just ask you here, right? Because I've been around for a while. I know what a bogan is, but if I use that term when I go back home, nobody knows what I'm talking about. And I guess the visuals, if somebody does know, is like a dude with a mullet and kind of a shitty mustache.
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary of the visual. So the bogan is typically somebody who probably is working class. They don't have a lot of high-class taste, so they're probably really into things like football. Maybe they drive a ute or some sort of big truck and have some big boys' toys kind of thing. So there's somebody who doesn't have a lot of cultural capital. But like I was saying, in Australia, they might have a whole lot of money. That could be a reality of the kind of work that they do. Whereas you might have people who are more middle class and perhaps they've got slightly higher class tastes. They like wine, they like music. So that's a different kind of culture than the cashed up bogans.
Okay, so are you talking about like the larrikin people or lower key people? What's the term? I've heard this term floating around. I'm not really sure what that is.
Yeah, so larrikin is another one of those kind of Australian identities, and I don't know if it's definitely part of our culture. But this idea that Australians see themselves as a larrikin, laid-back kind of people. So larrikin being somebody who's like a big personality, they probably cause a bit of trouble, they're a bit mischievous.
Oh, so like Crocodile Dundee.
Yeah, he's a lovable kind of guy that is not getting everything kind of quite right. Another good kind of cultural touch point at the moment is Shane Warne, so obviously passed away recently.
And who was he?
So, famous Australian cricketer.
Okay.
If you haven't come across him, that's fine. But also a guy who obviously achieved great things in sport, but had a whole bunch of controversies around his personal life as well. So, he's the kind of person that was celebrated and loved, but also kind of hated at the same time because of some of his or at least people loved to hate parts of him. So it's interesting kind of mashup of those different parts of Australian culture. It's not really well defined.
That really reminds me of where I come from. We have people who come from all around the world. There's a lot of migration that has changed the way that the United States looks like, and those migratory patterns have changed significantly over the past century or more, actually. And there's not really one American culture that people can really lay claim to, even though we do have politicians who try. So we do know, though, that there is something which is mainstream, where a majority of individuals feel like they belong to. And then we have also subunits, which might be called subcultures or countercultures. Now, in the US, I really think of musical subcultures that have existed over the past century, things like jazz, things like punk, things like drill. And the party crews that formed around some of the more contemporary things, party crews are like little wannabe gangs, I guess, that really are just there to party. But I have no idea about anything that's happening in Australian society. All I know is that the cultural touchstones of my peers when I was a student was to wear a suit badly. So what is the subcultures that we can really think about here in Australia?
Yeah, okay. So there's lots of different subcultures. We could kind of try and list and name them all, but I really think Australia is similar in many ways to what you're describing. There's the multicultural groups, the migrant groups, but also there's an important influence from places like the US and the UK, where a lot of our media in Australia is consumed from those spaces. And so our cultural identity is often caught up in those. So one of the important kind of cultural references that many people would be familiar with from the 1950s is these couple of groups called the Bodgies and Widgies. Right? So they're these strange names now, but for the time they were a style of dress and dance and identity for young people in Australia.
So that kind of reminds me of like the Mods and the Rockers or the Greasers, and what did you call them? The Rockers in the US as well, right?
That's it, yeah. So very similar. They're influenced by those groups. That's where we get that global influence of Australian culture. There's obvious associations in those examples, but others existing in Australia with class and ethnicity and gender as well. So often the Australian subcultural identities are kind of built around that. Particularly activities, like you said, music already, but of course sport as well.
Okay.
So you get people who are, like we mentioned, footy already, but perhaps a group who are associated with, say, surfing. So you get a surfy culture that goes with that as well. I mean, there's just so many of those cultures that come and go. I think the really interesting thing from a sociological perspective is to look at some of the persistent or consistent patterns around that. These subcultures often provoke a reaction in the media for the time. So I think you might have already talked about in this topic, moral panic.
Yes.
Yeah, great. So particularly Bodgies and Widgies and the Rockers and the Mods in those contexts, they had a big kind of moral panic. And perhaps that's part of the reason why we still remember them. These groups that were identified as being dangerous or violent. Some great footage from the UK during the Mods and Rockers era of a guy by the name of Stanley Cohen, who was recording what was happening there and doing interviews, and got footage of these groups going out and breaking things and fighting each other in public. But part of the analysis of that time is that these cultures probably wouldn't have got as much attention if the media hadn't also blown it up a bit and said, oh, these are these dangerous young people and we've got to really look out for them. And suddenly there's more people flooding to be involved in those kind of experiences.
Yeah, okay. So what are some more modern examples of groups like this? Because the Mods and the Rockers, you're talking about the 1950s,
Yeah.
and like those people are old and boomers and, not that interesting anymore.
Totally. Yeah. Okay. So maybe some contemporary language groups like essays get a mention.
Hold on. What's that? That sounds like a essay with a lisp.
Yeah, that's one way of thinking about it. So again, this is kind of the latest vernacular to refer to very similar kind of groups, because you might think of an essay as something similar to a bogan, but they're dressed a bit differently, and often they're described as dressing like tennis players. Right? So it's a low socioeconomic kind of group. Generally, that's the stereotype. They dress in a particular way, and of course, there's this moral panic that they're always looking for fights or trying to demonstrate their dominance through violence and those sort of things.
So essays are primarily boys then?
I'm not sure, but there seems to be a strong association with boys. I mean, would be an interesting kind of analysis to see if it was a gendered element to it for sure. There's some interesting work that's been done by people like Associate Professor Stephen Threadgold. He looks at these figures that we have in the media, and he says that they're ways of talking about class without using the word class. So we don't talk about class in Australia because that's a taboo topic, unless we're invoking some sort of class warfare. But that's usually our politicians trying to draw attention away from something else. And so we have these figures who we talk about and who are described as subcultures as a way to kind of represent that. And bogans and hipsters are really kind of a good example of that. Perhaps eschaism are another contemporary example of that. But if we think about the features, particularly if we kind of mentioned visuals before, right? Think about the visuals of a bogan and a hipster. They probably have some sort of facial hair that's unkept in some way. They probably have types of clothes that give the appearance of being low socioeconomic, and perhaps poor is another way of describing that. So they look very similar, but what's the difference between the two? And people like Stephen Threadgold, his suggestion is, well, the difference is that in the media we have a whole bunch of middle-class people, and they have certain values, and their values are reflected in one of the groups and not in the other. So in the hipster, we have these kind of middle-class tastes that go along with that, whereas you don't get that in the bogans. So the media kind of make a little bit of fun of hipsters, but it's kind of playful. It's a way of saying, oh, you're different, but it's okay.
Yeah, totally, because you need a lot of money for the hair gel that hipsters need, right?
Exactly. It's expensive to look poor. That's kind of the thing they're going for. But the bogan is an object of ridicule. So you are clearly different and not okay in some ways.
Got it. So a lot of the things that you're talking about had class markers, but we also know that there are other taboo subjects that folks don't really like to talk about here in Australia, like race or ethnicity.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. And again, one of the clearest examples of this kind of crops up in our media, particularly around things like election times, because we see references to gangs. Gang language comes out as a way to justify these kind of harsh, safety-oriented kind of policies. And recently in particular, but I think there's consistency here as well, there's reference to things like African youth gangs as a group who are somehow particularly dangerous. And the really interesting thing about this, of course, is that they don't represent gangs. Like what we know a gang looks like in terms of being organized and usually persistent, that's not what these young people are up to. You described, I think it was street parties? No, what was the term you used before?
Yeah, party crews.
Party crews.
When I interviewed folks, particularly when they were thinking about their lives in the 1980s or maybe the early 1990s in the US, they joined groups that were more interested in going out for a dance and hanging out, maybe doing some, recreational drugs. Chasing girls was a big part of it for the guys, and then being part of a social crew. But they weren't really interested in establishing territory in the same kinds of ways that we associate a lot with street gangs.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about, the difference here. So these gangs are invoked and race is invoked as a way to really scare public rather than as any real meaningful description of a culture or a subculture as such. And it's kind of interesting even at a level of, we talked about race and we talked about class, but the overlooked part of this is also age, right? So why are these groups targeted? Well, because they're young as well. And youth culture has this funny dynamic in our contemporary society and conversation is because one hand, it's incredibly desirable, right? Like people want to be young. There's this nostalgic thing where I remember my high school days, they were the best days of my life kind of thing. And that becomes an object of desire and as well can be marketed. So you sell things through appealing to how pretty young people are, kind of this object of desire. But at the same time, young people are this risk, like they're scary and dangerous and even implied kind of a subhuman animalistic thing going on where you don't have a rational brain, you have this kind of risky, risk-taking brain that goes around damaging things for fun and identity forming. And these kind of dual discourses of youth as a positive, hopeful thing and youth as a risky, dangerous thing are employed in both cases to kind of use youth culture for another, often media or marketing end.
It's quite interesting how those themes still persist today because young people are certainly engaging in less risky sexual behavior. They're using fewer recreational drugs. They're getting into less trouble overall here in Australia, and I think in a lot of the Western world. So what kind of gives with the persistence with this kind of narrative?
It's a really good question. And you're absolutely right. Like all those stats are true, that those risky behaviors of previous generations are lessening. So we could think about, maybe why that is, but it's a different conversation. But yeah, so why does this discourse around them being risky persist? Well, I would argue for the same reason discourses around certain ethnic groups being dangerous persist. Yeah, it's not because it's true, it's because it's part of the way that we continue to think about these minority groups within our societies.
Yeah, that's an unfortunate facet in terms of what the mainstream is, right? But the mainstream does change over time. We do see this in terms of how we think about things. I want to go back to this conversation of youth and violence, which you know quite a bit about. What are the experiences that young people have with violence today? And do some of these experiences drive the remaining subcultures? Like you mentioned, the Eshays and their association with violence, and I don't know what else there might be. How does it work in a contemporary context?
It kind of depends, I think, a little bit on your starting point. So, a lot of the dominant way of thinking about young people with violence starts with this assumption that there's something in young people that predetermines them to being violent, and that if we can just solve that problem through some sort of psychological intervention or a behavioral intervention, or just educate them better, then they'll choose not to use violence. But the cultural question asks, well, maybe there's something externally that gives people reason to enact that way of being. And that's what my theory, my kind of book about performativities is about. It says that there's places and spaces and systems within society that give people opportunity for expressing their agency, or not, or repressing their agency.
So can you give me an example? Because those are a lot of words that can mean a lot of different things.
Absolutely, yeah. So a good example is one of my favourite stories from my PhD research was this guy I was talking to, and he was telling me the story about being in Centrelink, so our welfare office in Australia, and he was trying to access some youth allowance, and he was there and watching and observing what other people were doing in the space. And he tells me a story about how he knows how to get what he wants in the Centrelink space. He knows how to, he says he comes in, he's real nice and polite, he asks nicely for what he wants, and he says things like, I don't know what's gone wrong, my payment's been cut off, can you help me out? And as he's telling this story, he then tells an example of, in his words, another bogan, who's also in the office that he's observed. And so those words are really interesting in terms of the way that we kind of have had a conversation about bogan, right, as this character of ridicule. So then to call someone else a bogan, but the way he says it is implying that he is also a bogan, right? There's another bogan. I'm a bogan, they're a bogan, this other bogan. So it's this self-identifying with that culture of ridicule, which was quite interesting in and of itself.
Did he visually code as what a stereotypical bogan would have been?
For sure, yeah. Like visually look at him, that would fit a stereotype, for sure. But to then identify in that space reinforces the kind of oppositional dynamic that takes place in those systems, right? So you come into Centrelink and you want to get access to welfare, and the state effectively doesn't want to give it to you unless you prove yourself worthy. And so you demonstrate that through a flurry of paperwork that you have this need, and then any variance from the narrowly defined reasons that you should get it, and they'll cut you off. So that's the dynamic that exists in that space already. So when this other bogan comes in, and they're screaming and shouting and yelling and getting angry at people and swinging fists and all that sort of stuff, obviously really quickly he gets booted out. But the question that I like to ask, and around this kind of performativities, is ways of performing or subjectivities, ways of being within that space are very limited. You come in and you're already in an oppositional dynamic. You don't have a choice about that. So you can only really enact that way of being, unless you can, like the young guy in my story, find ways to conform to the expectations of that. It's not that he gets outside of the oppositional dynamic. He just accepts that he is working in that space. And that's kind of arguably a goal of that structure already, right? So you can either accept you're in an oppositional dynamic and kind of conform to it, or you can resist it. They're really the options you're given, and that's external to the person, right? It's not about the individual. That's the structural social system that you're operating in.
So to go back to our question of culture and subculture, so in a sense, the guy that you were interviewing, he was understanding that he needed to engage in mainstream behavior, and he was identifying somebody who was part of his subculture but engaging in ways that were too oppositional to be able to move the needle, because the needle was being actually moved by controllers in the mainstream.
That's exactly right. So it's kind of easy to see it in terms of that Centrelink space. But cultures themselves, right, are social spaces that construct certain ways of being. Yeah, that's kind of another way to phrase it. So in other words, he's already a bogan. Right? He knows he's a bogan. He identifies as that. And so he can only operate out of that, either, again, conforming to it or resisting it in some sort of creative way. The catch really here is this kind of really interesting bit of work done by a guy named Henry Giraud, and is also kind of on the back of some other work that kind of exists around this idea of resistance. Are you resisting, or are youth subcultures really a form of resistance to the mainstream? That's kind of the question going back much further, even back to guys like Stanley Cohen, who we mentioned earlier. And so Giraud asks this question, well, like, is this really resistance, or is it actually, just another expression of some sort of taste or class? This young person in the Centrelink office is a good example, but maybe another clearer example is the young person who skips school. Right? Are they skipping school because they are really trying to, subvert the schooling system? Are they trying to change that system? No, probably not. They just don't want to be at school. And so, they're a different subculture or a different identity, but they don't have any radical significance to their resistance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, all right. As young people's experiences move online, how do you think this impacts youth involvement with culture and subculture, right? Because certainly when I was a young person and when you were a young person, we connected with people by force in person, right? Like, I didn't have a cell phone, and the first cell phones I had, all they did were connect you with voice and with really rudimentary text messaging, right? So all of this type of video connection, all of these high-speed types of experiences that folks have today, they just simply weren't a thing. But now we see all kinds of stuff unfolding and happening online. Like, I've got friends that have made friends, even married people that they initially met online and had significant relationships with them online, not just, a dating app, but actually having relationships with them online. So what is this online space going to do for culture and subculture?
It's an interesting space because obviously technology shapes the way that we communicate in those cultures. It's funny you're mentioning the really rudimentary text messages. I can't remember the number now, but at the time there was like a certain number of characters that you could put in a message, right? And you always had to limit your communication to that. So that it was only one message, you didn't get charged for two. I remember that being...
Right, because you only had like 100 messages for the whole month.
Exactly, which is mind-blowing today, right? Like, you don't even think about length, let alone number of messages that you would send. So obviously these new forms of media will shape young people's experiences of culture, and the social media is a really good example. It's continuously creating kind of new forms of connectivity. And it leads to this part of the dynamic that sociologists are talking about is this word global and local. And so you get this interaction between local subcultures and global subcultures. A really good example of this is something like hip hop. Obviously, it's got its origins in America, and again, kind of a certain class and ethnic identity that goes with that. But now there are hip hop cultures all around the globe, and hip hop has a certain amount of adaptability or local relevance where different cultures are picking up and say, okay, this is what hip hop looks like here. And so you get these local cultural phenomenons and subcultures where they have this global and local kind of relevance to them. The caveat with that, I will say, is that this kind of theorizing, this kind of research, has a very northern hemisphere, developed country, and even I would say metropolitan rather than regional focus, whereas technology is much broader than that, obviously, like it's giving access to much more regional spaces in ways that weren't previously. When I grew up in the country, about 5 hours south of here, and the cultural difference between the country and the city was pretty significant. We didn't have, kind of that global connection either. So lots and lots of changes. I don't think we fully understand the effect of media and social media on culture.
So, if you think back to your experience as a young person growing up, you were really disconnected from the culture of the big city because it was a big distance for you to travel. That was the same for me. Chicago was 4.5 hours away from where I grew up. So, the only way that I could see and experience the things that happened in Chicago was by making the occasional trip, and that only happened once in a while. How do you think that the internet is connecting students or not connecting young people, not just students, but to these cultures that are coming out of urban contexts?
So obviously the internet gives a greater level of connectivity there. And that's the idea of the global aspect of culture that comes within that title of glocal. But the other part of that is retaining the local identity as well. So again, that I'm just keep referencing this idea of bogan, right? Because it has so much contemporary relevance. But even part of that probably has this regional association, right? You get more bogans in the country kind of idea than you do in the city. So I think there's still a mix of both going on.
Well, certainly we see that culture evolves considerably here in Australia. We have so many different types of people who keep coming and who keep moving around internally. We see that there are a ton of pressures that change the way that we think about life. And I appreciate you coming today to talk about how some of those take shape with the youth of this country. Thank you so much.
It's been a great chat. Thanks.